So let's see, where should I begin? Maybe let me give you a little bit of background, because I sometimes find that's distracting. As I'm talking, people are like always thinking and inevitably ask me in the end, you know, wait, where were you born? Why do you speak with a perfect American accent? And so I'll just address that in the start. So my parents are both from Gaza. My mother's from Khan Yunis, my father's from Gaza City. And when I was, actually before I was born, they in the 1970s, in a huge wave of Palestinians, went to work in the Gulf, in the Arabian Gulf, where they were recruiting heavily from a very educated Palestinian workforce. So I was born in Kuwait, and then just when I was about a year or so, my parents moved to Saudi Arabia, where they worked for, at that time, an American oil company as physicians, and then it was eventually nationalized, and so on. So it was the system of it was essentially like living in a Houston suburb, but you know, in the Middle East. So that's where that comes from. But we had Palestinian identity cards. We didn't have any other citizenship, and that meant that we would have to go back on a yearly basis to, in our case, Gaza, to renew those ID cards, because if we didn't do that, they would be revoked from us by the Israelis, and that meant that we would not be able to go back any longer to Gaza. And so that was my yearly connection to Palestine, and it was very aggravating as a child, you know, going back and not understanding why we had to endure this. It was literally like a 3 or 4 day journey, you know, including like strip searches and all the humiliation and checkpoints, and you might arrive on any given day in the dead of night, there would be a curfew, and you know, the taxi would just drop you off. And so it was very miserable. It wasn't a fun experience. It wasn't like you were going on vacation. But it was something that, especially my mother, made sure that we did to keep our connection and our right to be able to return to our homeland.
So, what years?
So this is I was born in 1978, and then this was all throughout the 1980s. But, you know, my earliest memories of it, I would say, are 1988, which was the beginning of the first Palestinian Intifada, the uprising. And that's when the restrictions against Palestinians became more stringent. And you see this evolution over time, starting from 1967, when Israel formally occupied the Gaza Strip and the West Bank and East Jerusalem, to the present day, this ever increasing restrictions on Palestinian life and movement in general. And it began in 1967, and let me talk a little bit about that, because I mentioned this Palestinian identity card. In 1967, when Israel formally occupied the Palestinian territories, it conducted a population census, and so essentially went house to house. And it asked whoever the head of the household was to identify how many people were there in the house. And if you happened to be studying abroad, as many Palestinians were at that time in Egypt, or working, you know, wherever, or just visiting or something, you got excluded from that population census, and you suddenly lost your right to return to your own home. So what they did is, based on the number of residents in each home, they began to issue these ID cards, known as the Hawiyya, which exist till the present day. And the Hawiyya, this ID card, lies at the heart of this draconian system through which Israel controls Palestinian movement and Palestinian life in general. And it issues the cards based on your place of residence. So it began initially in 67, and then if your parents had it, you can obtain it through your parents, and so on and so forth. But you can't, it became over time that they no longer issue new cards if you aren't a resident to start with. So if you marry someone, for example, you know, in my case, my husband is not a Gaza resident. He's a Palestinian refugee who grew up in a refugee camp in Lebanon. So it was, at one point, it was the case that if you married someone who was not a resident of your hometown, you could add them to your card, and they would be able to come with you. Now that's no longer the case, and so you see, again, this ever-increasing restriction. So they've frozen that process of what's known as family unification, where you know, if you marry a non-resident Palestinian or even a foreigner, you can no longer add them. And so when I go to Gaza, I go alone with my children. He can't come with me. Now this equally applies to Palestinians who are married to each other from the West Bank or Gaza. Because if you have a Gaza ID, you can't travel to the West Bank any longer, and vice versa. In fact, if you have a West Bank ID, you can't travel to East Jerusalem, you know, unless you obtain a very specialized permit that's essentially impossible to get. Now, if you're a Palestinian resident of Israel, and you marry a Palestinian from the West Bank or Gaza, same thing. You can't legally live together, reside together. In fact, there's a great documentary about two Palestinians to which this applies, and you can find it in under the website loveunderapartheid.com. and it has a lot of these stories of Palestinians. But I always like to start at this point and talk about this idea, and I'll quote this sentence from Israeli journalist Amira Hass talking about the significance of this idea. And I talked about how essentially this system, this ID system, allows Israel alone to decide which Arabs, because it will refer to you only as Arabs unless you have the ID, and then it can identify who is Palestinian, who has a right to their land. So it decides which Arabs it will recognize as Palestinian, which couples it will recognize as families that qualify for reunification and thus residency, and who is allowed to move where and at what point, all in their own land. So now, this is Amira Hass saying, this control allows Israel to prevent the addition of foreign residents to the population registry. It allows them to intervene and even decide the choice of partner, the place of study, the type of medical treatment, address, quality time with children, participation in celebrations and funerals, the writing of wills, distribution of family property. Israel has the authority to ban the entry of friends or family members who are not Palestinian residents. Not just their entry into Israel, but into the West Bank and the Gaza Strip as well. So it's, it's not, no, don't think of it in terms of like a license, because license, if it kind of expires, you can renew it. That wasn't the case with the ID cards at that time in the 80s in Gaza. Now you no longer have to renew them, but again, if you don't have one, you can't obtain one. But if you're an East Jerusalem resident, if you don't renew it, and this only applies to Palestinian residents of the city, not the Jewish residents, if you don't renew it every so many years, it's revoked, and you can no longer reside in East Jerusalem. And so think of it as really, again, this mechanism of control, this ID card. And so that's what we would do. We would go back every year at that point to renew the ID card and make sure that we retained our ability to return. And it's kind of a double-edged sword, because having this card, which is approved by Israel, means that we would be able to return to Gaza. But it also means you're on their grid. And it means that they can control where you can move. So they would only allow us to go to Gaza, nowhere else. People always would ask me if I'm in Gaza, oh, can you meet me in the West Bank? Or I said, no, I can't. It's very stringent. It's only, allowed to go to one location, which is why you frequently hear analogies to apartheid laws because of that. Now, you may be thinking, well, Israel is no longer, we hear a lot in the news, no longer occupying Gaza, which is, of course, a legal fallacy, but the point being that even though they are no longer, within Gaza, but they still control Gaza, they still control the population registry, one of what's known as, in legalese, the former markers of sovereignty. So they still control this ID system. So anytime a child is born and has a parent who has this ID card, it has to go through the Israeli population registry system to add them. This system, this Israeli ID system, is still enforced by the Egyptians on Rafah crossing, meaning that only people with these Israeli approved IDs can use Rafah crossing to enter Gaza. So West Bank Palestinians can't, Palestinian spouses without ID cards can't, and so on and so forth. So it's still very relevant and very much at the heart of this Israeli system of control. So anyway, that's kind of the background of that, and I referred a lot to this ID card in the book, which is why I wanted to talk a little bit about it. But, as, I grew up, I left Saudi Arabia, I went to high school in Bahrain, neighboring Bahrain, and then eventually came to the United States for college. By this point, my parents had retired and returned to Gaza. Fast forward a few years, I'm in graduate school where I met my husband in Boston, who is a Palestinian with refugee status. And I got a job as a journalist for Al Jazeera that would take me back to Gaza. So it was very exciting for me because I would finally be able to go back, and live there more permanently. It was also very, nervous because I was newly pregnant at the time with my first son. And so I went back there in 2003 in the throes of the second Palestinian uprising and began to report for them. A few months later, I had my son back in Boston. So what I would do is I would commute back and forth every 4 months or so with great difficulty. And again, that's something I talk a lot about in the book. One of the themes is the, the difficulty of travel as a Palestinian, and this common theme of your Palestinian identity surfacing on borders and during travel. But anyway, every 4 months or so I would commute back to the US through the border crossing, and then from Cairo airport, which is the closest airport to Gaza, to the United States. So you'd have to fly into Cairo, drive 5 hours by land to the crossing. and then, you know, meet my husband over there because he couldn't come to Gaza. And I had my son, and then on one subsequent trip back, you know, I would go back and forth. He was about 8 months old or so. We flew into Cairo, and then we were told by the taxi driver that the crossing was closed to Gaza, which it frequently was. Now, at that point, it was physically controlled by the Israelis, and it was subject to frequent and indefinite closure. And so I said, for how long? He said, well, I don't know. And, you know, I found a friend initially to stay with, and, you know, my son was 8 months old. It was very difficult. And it ended up, you know, one day turned into 1 week, turned into eventually a month and a half of us waiting. And during this period, I started a blog at the suggestion of a cousin of mine. Now remember, this is at a time when there was 12 blogs total in the entire Middle East, if you can remember that time. So it wasn't a very common thing. And in fact, I myself didn't really know what I was doing, and I did it mainly as a family diary, to keep my husband in touch with, you know, what was going on with Yusuf, my son, and I. But then as the, you know, weeks turned into months, it became, you know, less strictly a family diary and more of kind of the intersection of the personal and political, and kind of an avenue to be able to share our story. And this isn't really the way I, you know, thought of it. It just kind of evolved into this, to share our story, you know, with the world, but also what I saw as a very universal Palestinian story, because it wasn't about us and our problems, you know, on the border or whatever, but it's, again, this very common Palestinian experience. Now, usually when people not familiar with the Palestinian issue, you know, are discuss this, or, you know, what comes to mind if you ask them, well, what do you think of, you know, they think of like what, bombs and suffering and house demolitions. But in fact, the most, you know, that's not what really tells the Palestinian story. And I began to think a lot about narrating the Palestinian story and owning the Palestinian story. And I think it was Palestinian scholar Sari Maqdisi who said that it's these, you know, quiet and ordinary moments that that make up the backdrop of daily Palestinian existence. This is really what it is to understand what it is to be Palestinian, to be able to, you know, and that's what I was thinking about. How can I be able to, because, like, you know, whenever I would write about this, somebody would inevitably say, oh, come on, it just sounds like a little bit inconvenient, or you're just waiting a lot. So I always was thinking about how can I kind of convey to them what this is about, that it's not just inconvenient. How can I convey dispossession and statelessness and this common Palestinian experience that Sari Maqdisi talks about. Rashid Al-Hadi calls it the quintessential Palestinian experience. And so that's eventually what the blog became about. It became about, you know, sharing this common Palestinian story, writing about, narrating the Palestinian story inside Palestine, but also outside, because so many Palestinians, the majority of course, are living Palestine on the outside, not on the inside.